Hey, folks, welcome back to another edition of Broken Brains with yours truly, Bruce Parkman, where we look at the issue of repetitive brain trauma, especially through repetitive head impacts in sports and repetitive blast exposure to our military veterans. And we look at how this exposure has impacted not only their brains, but their lives, and what we have to do as a society to identify, diagnose, and treat these individuals, and then do a better job to make sports and military service safe. We look at researchers and scientists, patients, advocates, and people across the spectrum of brain health and brain support, and bring them on the show so that you're informed about this, because this is a untouched subject in America right now. It's the largest preventable cause of mental illness in our adult populations, and we are not doing enough for it right now. Our guest today, very excited to have Dr. James Engall on board. He represents a Blast Analytics and Mitigation, or BAaM 360, and they're focused uniquely right now on the identification, diagnosis, and treatment of individuals from the issue of repetitive blast exposure. That is the exposure of their brain, their body, to the multiplicity of blasts they take with high caliber weaponry, indirect fire weapon systems, explosives, yada, yada. Earned his PhD from UC Davis, and his research focused on both the structural and functional neuroplasticity of the brain to injury and normal aging process. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Arizona, where he continued his research on normal and pathological brain aging, and he pivoted from academia to industry as a clinical neuropsychologist to help optimize outcomes for both high-risk brain and spine injury surgeries, while specializing in microelectrode recordings to facilitate deep brain stimulating electrode placement for the treatment of motor disorders. In 2017, he got the itch to get back into research and joined an ongoing research program that was collaboration with the Naval Special Warfare investigating training associated blasts. And he was instrumental to the USHU's Conquer program's blast monitoring efforts. And I think I met you at the USHU's conference early this year, because I was there talking about that. And as the architect of their weapons mapping program, he launched BAaM, which is the program we're getting ready to talk about here in 2020, and developed the first comprehensive blast monitoring program called Operation Blue Shield for high-risk operators in the law enforcement community. We have a lot to talk about. Dr. Engall, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for having me on.
Hey, so you've been through a lot, man, and we don't find a lot of people that are focused on the issue of repetitive blast exposure. So what got you here, and then what are you trying to do about it?
Well, what got me here is actually my interest in trying to understand like normal aging brain and how it degrades over time, either through normal processes or through pathological processes. And, essentially when I jumped into this, the blast world, it was almost by happenstance. The research program was looking for someone who specialized, a systems neuroscientist who specialized in multiple domains, and I fit the bill. Down the road, I actually inevitably led the project before it closed, and they shifted over to the Conquer program proper, where they were, doing a lot of pilot blast monitoring, where I essentially helped design a bunch of reports that are currently circulating throughout the DoD. I was also tasked to do some weapon mapping of all the different types of weapon systems that people have been reporting on, everything from small arms to the large caliber shoulder mounted weapons and howitzers, artillery, etc. And so I'm really excited about talking to you today about our current efforts, what I'm currently doing within the law enforcement community. Because as you know, they're also exposed to repetitive low-level blast throughout their op tempo, either through full-time or collateral duty. These guys are also taking a bunch of hits throughout their careers. So it's a little bit about me and kind of what we're doing. I'd love to get more into the topic.
Yeah, man. No, I love it, because, we really don't associate blast exposure, repetitive head impacts with law enforcement, okay, other than they might get in a fight, right? So with that population specifically, interestingly, where are they getting the most of their impacts from?
Okay, so a couple things. When it comes to law enforcement, depending if they're full-time or collateral duty, most of these guys are, again, getting most of their blast exposure in training, just like in the military. And in fact, I think their blast exposure is actually occurring more in training than actually out in the field, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about the different sources of blast, it's going to be large caliber rifles, 338, 50 cal, breaching, wall breaching, door breaching, and also shotgun breaching. And lastly, from energetics, just throwing flashbangs and, clearing rooms, things of that
Okay.
nature.
All right. Yeah, and a lot of people don't know that our law enforcement, law enforcement, officers are heavily involved in these types of training, just like the military. And yeah, to your point, they probably don't execute them as much in, say, combat, and really neither do we right now, given the fact that our wars are kind of declared over. But that's interesting, and it's very interesting. So when we talk about blast exposure to our viewer, what are you calling blast exposure? How are these waves produced, and what parts of the body are they impacting, and how are they impacting?
Sure. So when you think about the source, right, like an explosion or from a weapon system going off, there's either a high explosive or some type of propellant that's burning, right? That suddenly sets off a charge, right? And so you have like this source, this energy that's rapidly expanding from the source. Now within a weapon system, if it's inside of a large caliber rifle, it's that the primer is going to be struck and the projectile is going to come out of the end of the barrel. But all of that force that's getting that projectile out of the barrel is what's going to be producing overpressure. Now that might be that's just one source. Another source is obviously from like a door charge, breaching a wall, breaching a door, again, high explosive, or other sources like an energetic, like a flashbang. So when you think about how it's occurring, again, you get this rapid transient change pressure that's leaving that weapon system or device. Now, what
Okay.
it's doing,
Right.
I think that was your second question,
Yes,
is
sir.
as it's expanding from its source, right? Think of it as a bubble, right? And so when you think about an unadulterated like waveform, as it's expanding from its origin, you get like this like impulse energy, right? This what we call incident pressure, right? That's going everywhere in space. Now, as soon as that waveform starts interacting with the environment, either the floor, the walls, or the person, we can start getting reflections, right? And so those reflections also lead to exposure as well. So when we talk about blast exposure, we're talking about incident pressure, reflective pressures that can impact the person.
Okay. And then for our uninformed here, because we're getting ready to start dialing into what can we do about it, is where you come in. Now,
Yeah.
um, when that when that pressure hits the body, sometimes from our understanding, it could be two or more different waves that hit the body at different times, depending if they've been reflected off something, and if the organ's exposed directly to the source of the blast. So what's the concern? I mean, obviously you can't feel these things, right? I mean, everybody just goes through thousands of them all the time with supposedly no impact. So what's happening to our bodies when we're exposed to these waves when they come off the sources?
Well, sure. So a couple things are actually happening. So when you have a person standing in a blast field, right? That blast wave is going to interact with that individual. So as that blast wave starts, we're focusing on brain health. So as that blast wave goes through the skull, and if it's makes its way and can make its way through the skull, then it interacts with the tissues of the brain. Now, there's other ways for that energy to make its way into the brain. So as because it interacts with the body, and there's ways for the flow of the energy to go up into the brain that way as well. And
Wow.
so when we think about different ways to protect ourselves, obviously PPE is really important, but PPE, in addition to like helmets and wearing kits, chest protectors, side protectors, back plates, all these other things, these are all important mechanisms to help prevent that blast wave from actually impacting the person's brain.
And once that blast exposure is impacting the organ, what kind of damage is it doing?
Well, so when it comes to blast, there are a couple of theories that we're currently working off of on what it's actually doing to the brain, right? And so cavitation is an injury that seems to be leading the forefront on like what is actually occurring inside the tissue of the brain. So if you think about like uh, different types of injury mechanisms to the brain, it's not quite known today like what is actually occurring. There's a couple good theories on it, right? Cavitation, shear pressures that are occurring between white matter, gray matter interfaces, things of that nature. But um, like we know, we're still kind of early in its infancy and trying to understand like what is actually occurring in the brain. We know the outcome, right? But the mechanism that leads to that outcome is still being explored.
Okay. And that was my next question is here we are, 2025, right? We just had a military veteran take his life and blow himself up in a Cybertruck, obviously struggling with PTSD. He's been a active duty special operator since 2005. You can't really help but wonder if, the combat tours, the blast exposure and all that, because everything that has been said about this kid, obviously to your point, we know what the outcomes are. But here we are in 2025, no fault of yours. I mean, you just got into this part, 2020, and we've known like CTE or sports industries that you just can't do what we've been doing for the last 20 something years, especially because I'm a 1980s soldier. We trained with sticks, right? Ronnie Reagan gave us our first money, right? I mean, now these guys and girls have unlimited access to ammunition, to rounds, and they're either training for combat or in combat, which means they've had the most significant exposure to blast of any veteran population in the history of this country, right? And I think that corresponds with the mental illness that is driving the studies, the research, and the funding that that are leading to great programs like yours. So, I mean, do you have an opinion as to why it's taken us so long to get to this point? I mean, I don't even think the outcomes are really that known that long ago, to tell you the truth. It's just that we had all these mentally ill patients and veterans. We have suicide rates, the whole 9 yards, and it's just like, man, maybe it could be the blast exposure. This is a pretty new area of research.
Yeah, so when it comes to like what the problem is, right? I think there's since traumatic brain injury, TBI, it's kind of rooted in like contact sports and other types of mechanisms, people falling out of car vehicles, other types of incidents like sporting incidents that lead to some type of traumatic brain injury. When it comes to like understanding like what the actually outcome was, I think there was two competing theories, and the first one that popped up was obviously the tau hypothesis, that it's like an extension of chronic traumatic encephalopathy or CTE, right? And it wasn't until some work by Dan Pearl at USU at
Right.
USIS that kind of illustrating, look, there is something else that's going on here. And some of those seminal papers that showed, hey, look, this isn't CTE, this is astroglial scarring. And, when we think about what that means, like as to a neuroscientist like myself, or even to like a physician or a neurosurgeon or neurologist, we're like, oh, these are different mechanisms. They have different structural and functional changes in the brain. How that impacts like how neurons are communicating, how the brain's communicating, that might be the problem, but how you treat it, how you address it are different ways. So I think by understanding and accepting the fact that it's okay, well, this is a reactive mechanism of astrogliosis, like the natural brain's mechanism to prevent itself from injury from spreading, um, could be the path forward for us to understand how to treat it, right? And that's on the front end, or left to boom, left to blast, like I like to say, looking for prevention, mitigation techniques, detection techniques, things of that nature.
And that's where I think we're getting ready to start talking about what you're doing right now. Because I talked to Dr. Pearl, and he was like, look, we don't find CTE in veteran brains. Okay, sorry. He's like, we find other damage.
Right.
And now we can all agree that there is damage going on, that mental illness is the outcome that's causing us all this concern. Because if there were no outcomes and our brains could take all this stuff, we just keep training the way we've always done. But we've got a big
Exactly.
problem here. So now let's talk about, BAaM 360. Okay, so
Sure.
what are you focused on? What's different and novel about your approach and unique? And where are you at in the journey of trying to help our veterans and our military? Our veterans become healthier, and our military looking at better ways to you know to assess and compile aggregate blast exposure in order to monitor this for the life of the soldier.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, I had the crazy idea of trying to essentially mirror a program that the DoD was doing for the law enforcement community, right? I had the opportunity to just kind of, before I did that, take a step back and say, okay, these are the things that they're currently doing with the Section 734 working group, the highs and the lows, and said, okay, what are the best things that they're doing to really get in front of understanding blast overpressure exposure, blast exposure. And, a lot of this is, it gave me an opportunity to kind of start with like a clean slate and say, okay, well, one of the biggest things that we need to do and do better is educating people. And so we built a comprehensive program. Part of this comprehensive program that we call Operation Blue Shield. Phase one is all about education. That's what we do. We educate and increase awareness about the problem, blast overpressure exposure, how it impacts the brain. People who sit through my seminars or my debriefs learn about how the brain works. And then we sprinkle in, this is blast exposure, a little bit about blast physics and what types of pressures come off of the weapon systems that they're commonly around. So for us, when we had that opportunity to create this clean slate, we wanted to make it a comprehensive program and really get in front of it. So education, awareness. Phase two, we do some things where we can go out and understand more about their particular weapon systems and their environments that they're training in. So we do weapon mapping, device mapping in their environments to understand how pressure is interacting in those environments and while they're training. Phase two also has a cognitive baseline component to it. So one important component when we think about brain health, right, is knowing where we are today, right? Because if you're going to go out into a training environment, either tactically or as an athlete, you should know where you are today, because unfortunately there are risks to your brain health, and knowing that your profession is going to pull away from that, it's good to understand where you are today so that in a couple of years, it's not your partners, not your significant others, not your teammates who are like
Right.
seeing you drift, right? It's actually quantified. And so that's phase two. Phase three is actually an important component as well. This is where we actually deploy blast sensors, wearable blast sensors to the platoons or units. And then we track them for about 6 months. We get a good understanding of what they're being exposed to, their op tempo, and try to provide reports that are what we call actionable reports throughout the training cycles, so that they can make actionable changes following those events, so that they can decrease their exposures over time. And then importantly, with phase four, mitigation strategies, a post-programmatic debrief to kind of pull everything back together so that they get a full, complete picture of the program and how it may benefit them. So for us, we actually launched Operation Blue Shield with LAPD Metro D Platoon, so their SWAT team. And we've had the opportunity to work with some of the most elite units, and I have to say their professionalism, the way that they approached it, the way that they took the data and really kind of absorbed what they were getting and then applying it to make their team more resilient. Really hats off to them for doing that. So with that being said, there's other things that we do as well, some prevention mitigation strategies that we have in the pipeline. But
so this would be a great program for anybody to have that then could be used to justify a diagnosis and treatment of a RBE related disorder or impact to their brain. And
correct.
for our audience, right, let's talk about the blast. Like when we think blast, we think like booms, right? Huge concussive blows. Now I think the OSHA level or the Department of somebody said it was like what you can have up to 4 psi a day, right? That was the considered the level. Yet you can, I mean, what was like, so say somebody's got an AR-15 at home and they shoot that thing off and no ear pro. What kind of decibel level, what kind of PSI level are you looking at? Or just explain to our viewers how this is, how is it measured by what's the metrics? And give them some examples from, rifles to 50 cals to mortars and what's the corresponding, the PSI or decibel levels or however you're using, whatever measurements you're using.
Sure. Well, it's important to talk about when we talk about weapons and weapon and devices. We'd like to talk about sound as well, right? Because here's the thing. Like what blast overpressure is it's a supersonic wave that's moving faster than the speed of sound, right? Something, and the way that I like to talk about it is it moves from something that you hear to something you feel, right?
Okay, that's good.
So some simple, right now we're probably talking, when we put things into reference and how loud things are. There's different ways that we can measure it, right? So dBSPL, decibel sound pressure level, dBA, dBB, which are sound levels, decibels, but put in weights for hearing. And then we can expand upon that and say, okay, well, all of this is just pressure. So we can move dBs to pascals, pascals to PSI. Okay.
Okay.
So just for reference, we're probably talking about 65 to 70 dBA right now. That's how loud we're speaking going back and forth. A good common reference point, like especially for within the law enforcement community, is how loud a siren is. So a siren, again, there's a couple things that change intensity, such as proximity, how close you are to it. But a siren is about approximately 120 dB. Okay, so just for loudness levels.
They're loud.
So very loud, right? Once we start moving above that, right? There's some, when we think about hearing conservation programs that OSHA and other regulatory bodies have pushed forward, the amount and the intensity, how loud something is, either measured in dB or pascals, and duration, how many minutes or hours you could be exposed to it before you started experiencing some type of temporary hearing change. Once you get to 140 dB, something happens. It actually switches over to what we call impulse noise. So firearms and other devices often fall into this category of impulse noise. So when you think about impulse noise itself, it has to be over 140 dB and under duration of about 1 second. So very short duration. So that, when we think about firearms and other types of devices, flashbangs, or within the military community, grenades, artillery, the intensity and duration are going to be two different important factors. So the 4 psi component is really just kind of, in my mind, like a placeholder, right? It's a line in the sand. There's data that suggests that if you get exposed to 4 psi, you're going to have some lung trauma. At some point, you may even start experiencing some hearing changes, rupture an eardrum.
At 4 psi.
At 4 psi, yeah. But the important part of that is that when we talk about 4 psi, we're only talking about an intensity measurement. We're not talking about how much energy or the duration of that, because the shorter duration, the longer duration that it is, the more likely you're going to experience injury at lower levels. So we'll talk about that in a second. But
interesting.
We're moving along the spectrum. So 120 dB is about like a siren. When we think about like M4, we're talking about 163 dB dBA. Now, when you put that into perspective, 163, again, a lot of factors go into that. Length of the barrel, how much powder's in that bullet, and range and caliber, all these other things. But for like an M4, it's about 163 with a 16-inch barrel. So as you start to think about that, when you now pivot from dB to pascals to psi, 163 dB is just under point five psi. It's like 0.447 psi.
Okay, so half a psi is one shot from an AR-15.
From
Now
an,
you got
yep, an
a
impulse.
30
Yep.
round, so you got a 30-round magazine. You're looking at 15 psi.
Well, you can think of it in
I'm
different
just throwing
ways,
some
right?
math out for everybody, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm,
yeah,
I'm from
yeah.
the Massachusetts educational system, so I might be slightly challenged on these things. But all
Bruce, you
right,
ever shoot a 50?
yeah. So
Uh,
what's that?
have you ever shot a 50 cal?
Oh yeah, I own one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So bolt action or semi? Is it the M107 or like a Mark 15 style?
It's a Mark 15. I've got a 10 round. Well, I mean, it was back in the day, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's
So
semi-automatic.
cross-reference that. Okay, so an M4, right?
Right,
AR platform, right? 55 grain, 65 grains. You're looking at about a half a psi, just a hair under, right?
right.
So with the 50 cal, right? Now you're looking at 650, 750 grain type bullet projectile, and the amount of pressure depends on the length of that barrel. If whether or
Just
not they're
standard machine gun. It's on a not even a sniper rifle, but if you just had a 50 cal like an army guy would have on top of a trank with that
right,
big
right,
heavy barrel.
yeah, yeah, crazy. So when we think about how
PSI is that?
much, if it's so here's the thing, if there's what type of muzzle attachment at the end of that is really important,
Dude,
because if it's
back in
just
my
bare
day, it was
barrel,
not. Yeah,
if it's
back
just
in
bare
my day, it was
barrel,
bare metal,
yeah,
no
yeah.
break.
So bare barrel, the flow pattern that's coming out of the muzzle there is going to be directed more forward. However, if you put like a muzzle brake on, that energy is going to go sideways or back depending on the type of muzzle brake you have, right?
Oh wow!
So
And I
yeah,
got one on my
so
rifle too.
yeah, yeah, right. It makes it comfortable, right? It makes it
Yeah.
comfortable to shoot. Because I've shot the 50 cal semi and bolt action, and I have to say, like, it's punishing unless you have that muzzle brake on there.
Yep.
So, but you're looking at, depending on the length of the barrel and type of ammo, 3 to 4 psi exposure to the shooter.
All right, so barely a daily limit is pretty close to one round. And what I'm trying to get the viewers to understand is that, in the military and even in law enforcement, we just don't fire one round. I mean, we fire hundreds, if not thousands, because, in the Army, I know in Special Forces, we ain't bringing that back to the ASP. Okay, we're getting rid of
Yeah.
all the Carl Gustavs, whatever we got, we're bringing back brass. We're not going to bring back no live rounds. So we shoot until it's gone, right? And
Yeah.
so,
Well,
and that's what we're trying to here is just trying to give the viewer the idea of how much a military person, service member, how much of this exposure they could have, because it could be hundreds of times, even thousands of times, if you're shooting a lot of 50 cal of what is recommended just for one day, and that's all in one day. You get a lifetime of civilian exposure in one day. And
So, Bruce, one of the things to kind of, think about, because I've just been talking about like weapon characteristics, length of barrel, muzzle brake, grains, bullet, shooting position, right? Standing, kneeling, prone. Like if most people shoot the 50 cal in a prone position. I've
you
had the
have
opportunity, you
well,
know,
unless you're now a Navy SEAL, he might stand up and try to shoot that thing while standing up, but I
I,
make fun of
I,
him.
I had the opportunity to teach a blast overpressure section at the TAC Flow Academy, that's run by Mark Lang, in his
Okay.
large caliber rifle course, and they teach them how to shoot off of a tripod. So I had an opportunity to shoot a 50 cal off a tripod. Um, you know, uh, I have to say that it makes it a lot easier when there's a muzzle brake, but more importantly when it's suppressed.
Yeah.
So here's the mitigation thing. We're talking about 50 cals,
Where
right?
we go? Where
So
does BAaM 360 take all that? Now that our readers understand that, wow, these guys and girls are taking a lot of exposure. Now we know that exposure causes damage. Now you've got a
yep.
program focused on mitigation. So where are we with this? What are you doing, and where does this need to go?
So a couple things on the prevention mitigation side. We have a simple tool that we use to teach operators and warfighters about overpressure coming from those weapon systems. So it's a product that we call the blast mat, and we have them for the 50 cal, both bolt and semi-auto. We have them
I saw
for,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
here's the thing. It's a great teaching tool, right? Because the you put the weapon system down on top of the mat, and it gives the user the opportunity to interact with the invisible, right? Because now it's a color coded mat, like showing you where 4 psi is, or where higher pressures is and lower pressures are, and gives the operator the ability to kind of move from one place to another. Um,
So
just makes little subtle changes,
the mat tells them.
to what's that?
I'm sorry. So the mat tells them the level of exposure that they're getting when they fire.
It's unfortunately it doesn't actually tell them. It's not an active mat.
Okay.
We do have something in the works, to make something more active, but this is just a simple training tool to teach people about positioning,
Oh,
right?
okay. All right.
So when you think about different types of mitigation strategies, there's a lot of different ways to buy down your pressure, how much pressure you're taking, right? First off, you can use simulators and things of that nature. You can remove firing the weapon system. That's not really practical.
That don't work. Yep.
Um, but there's some administrative things that you can do, right? You can limit the number of rounds that they're firing in a day. The ANOR, the ALARA types of principles that can be applied to help reduce exposures to try to optimize operator and warfighter brain health. But really, the way that we view the blast mat itself is it's a tool for operators who are in an operationally necessary position, right? I need to use this weapon system, so I need to be able to know where I should be and shouldn't be to train smarter to reduce how much pressure I'm taking. Um, so when we think about, like, we've been talking about the 50 cal, it's that's just one type of mat that we have. We have them for all of the artillery, mortar type systems, even the big stuff. Even
Tankers.
like the tanks and the M109 Paladin, so that people know where they need to be and shouldn't be. So for instance, like if you ever drop mortars in your career, like
Yes, sir.
60s, 80, yeah,
120s, 81s, and
120s,
60s.
yeah.
Yeah.
So for instance, for the 81 millimeter mortar, we have a blast map for the 81 millimeter mortar system. And when you're thinking about learning how to use that weapon system, right? Really what the mat helps provide is a graphical training aid, or a visual tool to say, okay, I need to do, when I drop this mortar in, I need to, drop it, then follow it all the way down. And then you can look around in the field and say, okay, I need to put my head here. And if I put my head here, I'm going to get 1 psi. If I put it here, I'm going to get 3 psi. And it gives the operator to reinforce that training, to train smarter. So
So
the
what?
blast.
Like, it sounds like you might have. Do you get any pushback, like in sports? Like, we talk about subconcussive trauma and those little hits. Depending on how old the coaches or the players are, it's like, that's that they don't want to hear it, right? And so where are you? So the military, are they being? I know that some commands are being very responsive about the blast pressure. Are the soldiers now starting to understand that this is something that they need to take into consideration as they train, because it does impact their long-term brain health?
Yeah, I have to say that, from different perspectives, I think I'm seeing a change, especially guys who are on the back nine of their career, who's been experiencing this stuff for a long time,
Back
right?
nine, I like that. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. And they literally they start to see the effects and feel the effects. And so
Yep.
these are the guys that are now being like, okay, we need to do something for the next generation who are on the front nine of their career, right?
Right.
Um, and so those have been our advocates so far.
And those are the guys that have fought these wars. I was
Correct.
talking to a range safety officer for a shoot house, and
Yeah.
we always want to train like we fight. But sometimes, like I've been through countless doors, or I've been on the door, right, waiting for that crack. Number one guy, number two guy, no whatever. Right? I've been in a stack, waiting to go in, and then we find out that instead of being on the door, if you're around the corner, your PSI goes to nothing, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
can we still get the impact of training, knowing that because what we need to focus on, in my opinion, doctor, is most of our exposure is coming from training. It's like in football. If you took all your game days and put them against the amount of days of training and practice you had, that's going to be 80% of your exposure. So we
Yep.
look at training, and now in combat, you can't control combat. Yet in combat, we got to fight, we've got to kill, and we've got to come alive, and we still have to train to be as lethal as possible. But if we know that most of this impact is coming from training, then sometimes we don't have to train the way we fight. And I know that's going to piss a lot of people off because they're going to want to be on the door. Or, I talked to a Navy SEAL. He said he used to not only shoot 20 or 30 Carl Gustavs, he was the range safety officer. At the end of the day, he couldn't feel his fingertips. And he thought it was cool. It's like, wow,
Yeah.
I can't wait to
No.
do that again. Right. I'm like, dude, right. He goes, bro, I'm having my issues. Right. And these are all preventable. So I think what you're doing is really engaging, man. I mean, it's, how far are you along with DoD? Is your program being adopted, or are you working with military entities right now? Because this is hugely important as this
Yeah.
generation gets ready to fight the next war.
Yeah. So originally when I formed BAaM 360, it was to do more weapon mapping. And I pivoted like a couple months in after a retired operator from SWAT operator reached out, and he was explaining the same exact stories that I've heard over and over and over again. Um, and he was like, he had a compelling story about, there are these operators out there who are being overlooked, and we can't wait 7 years for this technology to be adopted within the SWAT community. And I completely agree. And so for us, we've been focused on the law enforcement community, building rapport within the tactical community, um, within the law enforcement community, but also more importantly, we are starting to pivot back because we do have uh, the abilities to do a lot of these weapon mapping and facility mappings to be able to help them understand what their types of pressures they're receiving to help buy down pressure. Because at the end of the day, there's a couple things that you mentioned I wanted to go back to, because you did ask me a question like, do we get any pushback? Some of that pushback is, we train like we fight like we train, and we don't want to deviate from that, right? Because there are risks, right? I totally understand and appreciate those risks, but we can try to figure out ways how to train smarter. So, like you said, if you want to be the first one in the room and right on that, and maybe you're pushing the K past K18, so you're going to take more than 4 psi. If that's operationally necessary, like
To do
that's
it.
a decision that has to happen. But if it's not operationally necessary, push back beyond K18, maybe go K35, K45 plus 2 corners. Like,
Right.
understand that overpressure is a threat to your brain health. And if you want to, make it into your wherever your career goal is, right? And that's how I always start. Like, I always start off these conversations with operators, and whenever I give my brief on the education piece, it's like, where do you want to be? Like, where are you in your career? Is this a job? Is going to be a 4 to 7 year stick for you, or are you going to stay in this for 20, 30 years, right? um, because knowing that you're in it for the long haul, you might start making some changes in your favor, which is really important to get you to your goal, right?
No.
It's like,
And,
okay, you want to retire with X amount of money in the bank.
and a
Well,
brain that works. in a
well,
in a in one marriage, not 3 or 4,
well,
like all of us, right? I mean, it's
Well, everyone's got to start thinking about their brain health, just like there's, saving money in the bank. Like you have to be able to build this reserve to be able to get to those goals. Otherwise, every single time you get hit in the head, every single time you take some pressure from a weapon system, You know, we're not diving into the, you know, the potential genetic components or prior history of exposure, but all those things like can lead into like, you know, when someone might start experiencing symptoms.
No, and you know, and it's you know, look, you got to train like you fight, and nobody's gonna say don't, but you don't have to train like you're gonna fight every day, right?
Yeah,
Once you're the number one man in that stack, and you've all gotten, you know, that feeling, right? That exposure, you know, that's what we're gonna do when when it's game time. Okay,
yep,
now. Can you go around the corner and just practice your flow drills and other things that are just as important as experiencing that shockwave, but also, you know, going in there and dominating your field of, you know, your sectors of fire, the whole everything that you do, and you go do that particular job. So I
yeah,
think, yeah, to your point, we have to train like we fight, but we don't have to train every day. And I've told a lot of commanders this, like, look, man, we are, you know, you can only be as good, you know, once you're good with a weapon system, right? You're good, all right. You gotta go at it all the time, you know. And then the other part is if our special operators, you know, if I paid as much attention to my brain health as I did to my physical health, all right,
right, right,
running, lifting, diving, swimming, doing everything I could to be, you know, I was, you know, be a Green Beret, right? I mean,
yep,
my physical fitness, you know, but next to my job, but my job skills, physical fitness was right there. I mean, that was like sex, right? I mean, physical fitness, sex, alcohol, they all encompassed like my entire life when I was a soldier. It's all I cared about, right? Am I fit? Can I do my job? And, you know, and where's my beer? And I'd like a little bit of love, right? That's how I live. And that's how a lot of our guys live. And they are now, and I think to your point, they're now starting to understand how valuable this is. And I got to take care of this because otherwise, all this other stuff is going to go away. And I'm not going to be
yeah,
good at my job. I'm not going to be good at relationships. I'm not going to, my physical fitness is going to go to crap. I mean, we talk to so many veterans right now, Dr. Engall, that are, you know, they don't even get up and they can't even work out because they are just hurting because they didn't take care of this because we didn't know. And nobody's pointing any fingers, man. You know, I was, you know, talking to some 4 stars about this stuff. It's like nobody's looking to blame anybody. We're looking, it's like, what do we do now? And the now is, yeah, I mean, we've got to train effectively. We got to train to be lethal. But, you know, we since 9/11, Doc, these guys and girls have been going at it. And we're paying the price, whether it's mental illness, whether it's suicidality, broken marriages, broken relationships. This price is being paid. These kids did nothing wrong. They volunteered for the military. They did their job, and unfortunately, they got hurt. Now we've got it. And so talk a little bit about this. We don't have too much more time, but talk about are you doing anything on the diagnosis side to identify people that, I mean, I'm sure you heard about an MBEV or, you know, a GBEV, you know, these, you know, we don't have an idea how much you can have, of course, because the brain's different for everybody. But on the diagnosis side, do you have any, like, we have people listening right now that might be some of these folks, right? So
yeah.
from the, you know, diagnosis side, what is your program doing to help us identify the folks that might need help that might not be aware of
Yeah, so you know the things that we're doing on the diagnosis treatment side, we're forming partnerships with particular companies that are in the diagnostic space.
it? Okay.
And so, you know, one of the things that you can kind of think about, right? I always like to say this, like proof's in the pudding, right? If you start having symptoms, you're out, you're in your second year, your fourth year, your 10th year, your 15th year. You know, symptoms are, you know, unfortunately, are what guiding us. And I'm a firm believer that, you know, outside of cognitive changes and behavioral changes, there are little subtle tells that you have had a traumatic brain injury or have currently a traumatic brain injury. And I think where, you know, I'm a really big proponent of eye tracking, and
Really?
measuring pupillometry and eye tracking type of stuff, because really at the end of the day, like eye tracking, I think is going to be one of those things that help with the diagnosis of a TBI or concussion or non-concussive injury, right? Because at the end of the day, like our eyes, there's when you think about what controls our eyes, the circuitry that goes into it in our brainstem, and you know, helping us pick targets, things that are cortically mediated. I think eye tracking is one of those technologies that we're going to see more of in the future. when we think about the diagnosis of any type of traumatic brain injury as a whole.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about that. We've been looking for a pupillometry app to put on the phone to recommend to parents because the kids will say, "I ain't had a concussion." Like, well, watch this little thing, right, or whatever, however they work. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that would be an amazing, ability to help us. And then, of course, to your point, we have to educate our community that these cognitive, behavioral, and psychological changes that your husband or your partner's going through, right, or your wife, could be related to their job, and they need help. It's not their childhood, right? It's not that
Yes.
they might have seen a couple bodies. It could be, right, there's psychological trauma, but it also could be the changes that their job has caused. So,
Yeah, well, I'm a neuroscientist, so for me, when I think about psychological trauma, I take a very organic perspective on it, and how the brain works, neural circuitries that lead to memories, things of that nature, and how brain injury can alter those circuits to really, have someone re-experience something in real time um, that may have, just be a distant memory. So those are all interesting things that when you think about what potentially traumatic brain injury is doing to how we process information and retrieve information.
that's amazing. Well, Doc, I really appreciate the time you spent with us today. This is outstanding, and I really thank you for the work you've done. And we want to know more. Would love to stay in touch with you. We have a community of providers that treat veterans that have been diagnosed with RB, and to include law enforcement officers. There's a
Yeah.
lot of innovative approaches out there to brain health that aren't covered by the FDA, and we're working on that with the VA. So love to know more about you because that program could be part of some of the recommendations we're making to Congress right now to implement changes instead of just talking about it, and getting off our butts when it comes to these veterans and law enforcement officers that have been impacted by their careers. So, man, hats off to you. Please stay in touch with us. And before we go, how do people find you? Talk a little bit about yourself and what you have going on, and let people know what they can do to stay in touch with you.
Sure. Yeah. You can find out more about what we do. Go to our website, www.baam360.com, BAAM360. Talks a little bit about what we do and how to get a hold of us. You can reach out to me directly if you have any questions about the program. There are other things you can do as well. If you're curious on different approaches to brain health, I have a bunch of different resources for you guys as well. So if you're interested in understanding more about BLAST or understanding more about traumatic brain injury, or if you're someone within the law enforcement community or veteran in the law enforcement community and you're struggling, we do have resources through our partners as well, through Copline and the Ohio State, that I think would be really beneficial for you guys.
We'll be reaching out because the one thing that's lacking for our veterans right now is a resource guide to repetitive blast exposure, and we're working on that right now. So we'd love to work with you on it and get something out there for our veterans that would be a more informed book, guide, whatever, for them to understand what is going on and then what to do. What do I do now? Right? I've
Yeah,
already left. I'm already suffering. What do I do now? So yeah, love to work with you. Dr. James
awesome.
Engall, BAaM 360, thank you so much for what you're doing, your dedication to our service members, and we look forward to seeing you on the show again, sir. Take care.
Thanks, Bruce.